Before you start reading this moving true story, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, like it, and activate the bell. This helps us a lot to continue sharing stories that touch the heart. That Saturday morning, the sky was clear, and the air carried the sweet scent of flowers from the backyard. Emily Carter, just 5 years old, ran her fingers through the petals of the daisies her mother had planted while pretending that her dolls were on a picnic. It was one of those ordinary, peaceful days when nothing seemed threatening. Her parents were indoors, distracted by simple tasks, one preparing lunch, the other organizing the garage. Emily, dressed in a light blue dress and her hair tied in 2 messy ponytails, seemed completely oblivious to any danger. She was an introspective, soft-spoken girl who loved stories in picture books and had a special fondness for animals. Her parents used to say that she was made of silence and tenderness. No one imagined that that day would change everything. What happened next happened too quickly for anyone to react. A sharp thud of the gate opening, heavy footsteps on the grass, and then a strong arm grabbed Emily by the waist. There was no time to scream, only the muffled sound of the dolls falling to the ground and the desperate shuffling of the girl's little feet. The kidnapping attempt was interrupted by an alert neighbor who jumped over the wall upon hearing the commotion and managed to stop the attacker before he reached the street with the child. When the parents ran into the yard, they found Emily lying on the ground, her eyes wide, her face pale, and her arms shaking as if she didn't know where to hide. She wasn't crying. She just stared blankly into space, as if something inside her had been turned off. Emily didn't say a single word in the days that followed. Not when the doctors tried to talk, not when the parents begged with teary eyes, not when the psychologist tried to use games and toys as a bridge. She just watched everything with that distant look, as if reality had stayed outside her head. During the first few nights, she would wake up startled, clutching the pillow so tightly that it left marks on her tiny fingers. But even in his nightmares, he didn't scream. Silence had become a shelter, or perhaps a prison. The diagnosis came with the coldness of clinical terms. Selective mutism, a common response in children who face intense trauma. Speech, although physically possible, had become a territory forbidden by the memory of fear. The devastated parents tried to maintain a normal routine, but the absence of Emily's voice filled the house with a heavy silence. The sound of the television on, the dishes being washed, even the birds in the backyard. Everything seemed louder, more invasive in the face of that childish silence that cut like glass. It was during one of these sessions with the psychologist that the suggestion came up. Perhaps an emotional support dog could help. Rebuild bridges between Emily and the world. The idea seemed simple, almost banal, given the complexity of the trauma, but the parents accepted. That was when Rex entered the story. A German shepherd with a slightly graying muzzle, an imposing figure, and an old scar on his back. A legacy of his time in the police force. The first time Emily saw Rex, it was as if a gap had opened. She didn't speak or smile, but slowly reached out her hand until she touched the dog's fur. Rex, in turn, remained. Still, his eyes attentive, as if he recognized something in that girl that could not be explained. It was a kind of silent understanding, almost raw, but pure. From that moment on, he accompanied her everywhere, in the sessions, in the school hallways, even on her visits to the courthouse. Rex was now her shadow, or perhaps her voice. The routine with Rex gradually broke the rigidity of silence. Emily still didn't speak, but now she pointed with her fingers, made small gestures with her hands, and most importantly, kept her gaze steady when she was with the dog. During the first week together, she began to sit next to Rex on the couch, lay her head on his chest, and follow his slow breathing, as if seeking some kind of refuge in it. Sometimes she would draw pictures on sheets of paper and show them to the dog as if he could understand, and somehow it seemed that he did. Rex didn't react with euphoria. He just remained present, with that serious and attentive look that gave the feeling that nothing went unnoticed. The parents noticed that although Emily didn't say anything, she began to sleep better. There were no more early morning starts, nor the pillows crumpled in despair. It was as if the presence of that animal brought a sense of protection that not even adults could offer. When the news came that Emily would have to appear in court, her parents froze. The prosecution had decided to try an unconventional approach, to bring the girl to the hearing, not to speak, but to be present. It would be a way to show the jury the impact that the crime had had, even without words. And more than that, there was a timid hope, almost desperate, that with Rex by her side, perhaps Emily would react in some way. Deep down, no one expected a miracle, but everyone knew that without her, the case against Richard Hale was too weak. There was no physical evidence, no eyewitnesses other than Emily herself, and Hale was smart, articulate, with a sharp defense and a clean record. The courtroom was no place for a child, but in this situation there was also no other way. That was when they decided Rex would go with her. And for the first time, the girl didn't hesitate. When her parents told her, Emily simply stroked the dog's nose, as if silently saying, "Okay, if he comes with me, I can do it." On the day of the hearing, the tension seemed like a character in itself. The court hallway smelled of reheated coffee and old paper, and the sound of hurried footsteps mixed with the muffled buzz of conversations between lawyers. Emily entered through the side door, holding Rex's leash tightly, while her parents walked a few steps behind, visibly nervous. She wore a light yellow dress with small flower embroidery on the fabric, and her hair tied with a white bow. But what caught the most attention was the firmness with which her fingers wrapped around the dog's leash, as if each step was only possible because Rex was there. In the main hall, everyone turned when they saw the pair entering. It was unusual to see a dog inside a courtroom, much less a German shepherd with the build of an ex-cop next to a silent child. But the judge had authorized it, considering the medical recommendation and the emotional impact of the case. Richard Hale sat in the dock with the impeccable posture of someone who knew how to play the system. He wore a well-tailored dark grey suit, thin-rimmed glasses, and a calm, almost bored expression. When he saw Emily enter with Rex, for a brief second, his eyes narrowed slightly. A detail almost imperceptible, but one that Agent Monroe, sitting at the back of the room, did not miss. The session began in a formal manner, with witnesses being called and arguments being presented. Emily sat next to her mother in a reserved chair, and Rex lay beside her, his chin resting between his paws, looking calm. But his eyes remained fixed, alert to the slightest movement. It was as if every muscle was ready, silently prepared. And it was. When the defense attorney stood up to give his explanation, that something unexpected happened, something small but impossible to ignore. Emily lightly touched her mother's shoulder and made a gesture with her fingers, something simple, learned in therapy, almost like a code. Rex, upon realizing this, stood up in an instant, stiffened his body, and let out a deep, firm, and directed bark straight at the defendant. If this story has touched you so far, leave a like, comment on what you felt, and share it with someone who will be moved by it too. It makes all the difference. The silence that followed Rex's bark was almost louder than the sound itself. For a few seconds, no one moved. The judge frowned. The defense attorney tried to hide his discomfort, and the jurors looked at each other as if waiting for some logical explanation. But Rex didn't calm down right away. He remained standing, focused on Hale, his muscles tensing visibly, as if he recognized a familiar danger. Emily, for her part, wasn't crying or shaking. She just stared at the dog, as if everything was happening exactly as she expected. The gesture she'd made with her fingers was a warning signal, something her therapist had taught her to help her express fear or discomfort without using words. And Rex had responded precisely as if he'd been specifically trained for this situation. But he hadn't. This was more than training. It was instinct. It was pure perception. The prosecutor, sensing the impact of the moment, called a break. During the break, Judge Sullivan called Officer Monroe aside for a private conversation. Rex's behavior had turned on a light no one had expected, especially since the dog, although retired from the police force, had an impressive track record of handling kidnapping cases. And there was a scar on his back that bore a long history, a traumatic rescue of a child who had been held captive for weeks. Monroe, experienced, knew that dogs like Rex did not react randomly. The intensity of that bark, the way his body had reacted, all pointed to something deeper. That was when the hypothesis arose. What if Rex was recognizing not only Emily's tension, but also the very scent, the energy, the behavior pattern of someone he had faced before? The idea seemed unlikely, almost absurd, but not impossible. And Monroe, with his trained intuition, knew that it needed to be investigated thoroughly. The next day, Monroe began a parallel investigation. He couldn't rely solely on a dog's instincts, but something about that behavior kept resonating in his head. He started with the old records of the cases Rex had worked on. He went through reports, forensic reports, operational bulletins, and old photographs of the operations. And then he found a detail that made his stomach turn. On Rex's last mission, years before, there had been an unconfirmed suspicion that the kidnapper was part of a larger network, but the case had been closed without evidence. One of the reports from the time mentioned a polite, discreet man with knowledge of logistics and no prior record. The profile fit Richard Hale in an eerie way. Monroe, suspicious, requested a more thorough examination of Hale's vehicle, which had so far revealed nothing relevant. And that was when the story began to take another shape. During the inspection, the experts found traces of textile fibers and biological residue in the trunk. Barely visible traces, but enough to warrant a search warrant on properties associated with the defendant. One of them was an old cabin registered to a company Hale had acquired years earlier, and that had not been connected to the case until then. The location was remote, surrounded by tall grass and far from main roads. Monroe decided to bring Rex in on the operation, not out of protocol, but because something inside him told him that this dog still had more to reveal. When they arrived at the location, the cabin appeared abandoned. The doors were jammed, the interior dusty and silent. But it was Rex who gave the first sign. He sniffed at an area close to the ground, began digging with his front paws, growling low and tense. Soon the agents discovered a hidden entrance, a sort of trapdoor disguised by loose boards. And there, beneath the cold wooden floor, was a basement. The basement was dark and damp, with peeling concrete walls and a musty smell mixed with something indefinable, a cold metallic odor that bothered even the most experienced agents. The beam of the flashlights revealed thin mattresses on the floor, a few dust-covered children's toys, small clothes folded with disturbing precision, and a child's sketchbook with pages scribbled on by shaking hands. Rex stopped at a smaller iron door in the corner of the basement and began barking steadily with increasing intensity. Monroe approached cautiously, gave the signal, and the agents broke down the door. What they saw there was a silent shock. A girl, thin, with huge eyes and frightened, sitting in a corner with her knees drawn up to her chest. She was alive. It was Emma Sullivan, missing for months, presumed dead by the media and forgotten by many. When the agents approached, she backed away, but when she saw Rex, her reaction was unexpected. She smiled shyly, extended her hand and said, in the weakest voice imaginable, "Dog." The operation was closed that day, with Emma's rescue making headlines around the country. The connections began to form like pieces of a twisted puzzle. The belongings found in the basement, the physical evidence in Hale's car, the purchase records for the cabin, all of it now pointed to a pattern. Hale wasn't just the perpetrator of a botched kidnapping. He was part of something bigger, a silent, calculated network protected by a veneer of normalcy. And it all began to crumble because of a child who couldn't speak and a dog no one expected to play any role. In court, the evidence began to pile up, making any defense argument impossible. Hale, went from a confident defendant to a cornered man, cornered by details he had previously thought irrelevant. And yet, he remained silent. He wouldn't confess. He wouldn't admit, until Emily returned to the courtroom for the last time. This time, the atmosphere in the courtroom was different. There were cameras outside, curious people on the sidewalks, and journalists fighting for space to capture any image of Emily and Rex. But inside, the atmosphere was even more intense. The prosecution had prepared everything carefully, respecting the girl's boundaries and legal protocol. Emily walked through the same door, wearing the same light dress and the same bow in her hair, but something about her was different. Her steps were firmer, her gaze more present. Rex walked beside her as always, but now his presence seemed almost ceremonial, as if they both knew that this would be the last act of something much bigger than they had imagined. When she sat down next to her parents, Emily didn't look at anyone. She just rested her hand on Rex's back and kept her eyes fixed on the judge. There were no words, but everything in her said she was ready. The prosecution asked for permission for Emily to demonstrate once again the gesture she had learned in therapy. The judge agreed. The room fell silent, and everyone watched as the girl calmly repeated the same movement with her fingers, almost like an invisible signal. And, as before, Rex stood up, firmly, slowly turned around and fixed his gaze on Richard Hale. But there was something different now. The dog did not bark. He simply walked up to the defendant and stopped right in front of him, staring at him for several long seconds. It was as if he were faced with something that needed to be acknowledged. One of the jurors became emotional. The judge, visibly moved, called for an immediate recess. Backstage, Hale was taken to the private room, and there, finally, he gave in. For the first time, his voice trembled. He asked for a lawyer and said bluntly that he wanted to confess, not out of compassion nor remorse, but because he felt in the eyes of a dog that it was all over. The confession came in full, without beating around the bush. Hale recounted not only Emily's failed kidnapping and Emma's captivity, but also other cases that had not yet been officially connected to him. He revealed details, routes, names of accomplices, and even the existence of a second storage location for the victim's belongings. Still, unknown to the police, the prosecution was stunned. The case that had previously been on shaky ground had now become a scandal of national proportions. Within days, new warrants were issued, other victims were identified, and Rex began to be mentioned in the news not only as the support dog of a traumatized child, but as a silent hero, an unlikely link between justice and the forgotten. Emily, even without speaking, became a symbol of strength for many families. Her image alongside Rex went viral on social media and moved the entire country. But for the Carters, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or in Hale's arrest. It was in the little details, like the way Emily started drawing again, the smiles that began to appear shyly at certain moments of the day, and, mainly, in the spontaneous gestures of affection she made with Rex, as if he were more than a dog, but part of what reconnected her with the world. The psychologist explained that it was a slow process, that Emily's voice might not return immediately, but the bond with the dog was, in itself, a huge step forward. And then, one random late afternoon, without warning, without rehearsal, while they were in the backyard remaking the toy picnic that the girl loved so much, she looked at Rex, ran her hand over his head and said in a low, hoarse voice, "Thank you." It was the only word, a single word after weeks of silence. But it was enough for the parents to embrace, overcome with emotion, and understand that healing was not a destination. It was a journey, and it had begun there. After that day, something changed in the rhythm of the house. Emily didn't suddenly turn into a talking toddler, nor did she start talking as if nothing had happened. But now, every now and then, he would drop a few loose words, almost always to Rex. A come, a sit, a stay. Simple words, but they rang like bells in the parents' ears. It was as if each syllable broke through a layer of fear. The therapy sessions began to progress more quickly, and the psychologist realized that Emily's progress was directly linked to Rex's presence. He was the channel, the invisible translator of her emotions. And even outside of the sessions, Rex always stayed close, watching the girl's every step with the calm of someone who has seen the worst and now protects what is most pure. The two formed a duo that went beyond any clinical explanation. It was a genuine connection, built on silence and trust. Justice took its course. Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of appeal. Judge Sullivan, when closing the case, made a point of recording in the minutes the importance of Emily and Rex's participation in resolving the case. It was the first time that an animal received formal mention at the end of a trial of that size. The repercussions spread, and even the FBI began to study ways of incorporating retired dogs as support in sensitive cases. But for Emily, all of this was just background. What really mattered was being able to play in the yard again without looking back in fear. It was sleeping without holding on tightly to the pillow. It was knowing that if something scared her, Rex would be there. A dog marked by life, just like her, but who still found the strength to protect, welcome, and listen without demanding anything in return. And maybe that was what slowly healed her. Being understood by someone who also had invisible scars. In the months that followed, Emily and Rex's story was told in news reports, documentaries, and lectures, but what no one saw was the silent daily life between the two, where the real reconstruction took place. Emily began to take Rex everywhere, even on quick trips to the bakery with her father. And it was curious to see how people's looks changed when they saw that pair passing by. A big, serious dog with a scar on his back, guided by a fragile girl who barely said a word, but carried a strength that could not be measured by speech. Sometimes, on good days, she would even hum softly, looking out the car window. Other times she would have relapses, bouts of fear, moments of silence, restless nights. But Rex never changed. He remained there, by her side, like a silent pillar, absorbing everything, without rushing, without pressure. Once, during a visit to a municipal park, Emily saw a group of children playing with their dogs. She hesitated for a few seconds, watching from a distance, as if trying to decipher whether that place was safe or not. Rex, noticing her hesitation, took a few steps forward, wagging his tail slightly. That was enough for Emily to gather up the courage and walk over to the group. She didn't say anything, just sat down on the grass next to the other children and let Rex interact with the other dogs. And for the first time since the kidnapping episode, she played outside the house, in an open space, without hiding behind anyone. That, for her parents, was almost a miracle, but without lights, without applause. It was just another small step, perhaps invisible to the world, but gigantic for those who knew the way back to normality. Because deep down, that was what their lives were trying to rebuild. A routine that seemed normal again, even though they knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Over time, school became part of Emily's routine again. At first, the teachers were instructed to respect her limits, without forcing her to speak or participate in group activities. She attended classes in silence, always with Rex lying down next to her desk, authorized by a special decision from the principal. Interestingly, the presence of the dog also positively affected the atmosphere in the classroom. The other children, who had previously been distracted and noisy, began to act with more empathy and care. It was as if Emily's silence and Rex's calm demeanor had infected everyone around them. Some teachers said that the class had matured more in just a few months than in previous years. And Emily, even without speaking, began to interact, and she pointed, wrote words in her notebook, smiled more often. Every small gesture was a victory. Fear still lurked somewhere, but now she knew how to face it, calmly, with presence, with Rex. One day, during a group activity, a classmate dropped a box of pencils on the floor, making a loud, dry noise. A simple sound, but one that would have been enough to send Emily into a meltdown. But that day, she simply turned around, looked at Rex, who didn't even move, and then calmly looked back at the board. The teacher noticed and discreetly noted the moment in her teaching diary. It was a silent but significant milestone. The trauma was still there, but Emily's reaction was different now. She had learned over time, and with the support of her dog, that not every sudden sound represents a threat. This was more than resilience. It was emotional reconstruction in its most discreet and profound form. There were no inspiring speeches or magical endings, just small daily achievements that together formed a real path to overcoming. Rex, despite his advancing age, remained strong. He no longer ran as he used to, nor climbed stairs as quickly, but his presence remained unshakable. Emily noticed these changes and, even without expressing everything in words, she cared for him with an affection that was impressive. She brought him fresh water, adjusted the blanket where he liked to lie, sat next to him when she noticed he was getting tired. It was as if the roles had now been reversed. The one who had previously been the protector now became the caregiver. And this, according to the therapist, was another powerful sign of emotional progress. The instinct to care, the bond of reciprocity, the sensitive look at the other. Emily was no longer just the girl who needed support. She was someone who also offered support. And Rex seemed to understand this with a serenity that only dogs seem to have. The Carter family knew that the bond between the two was rare, almost inexplicable. It wasn't just gratitude nor just therapy. It was something deeper, built during difficult times, in shared silences, on nights when neither of them slept. Even with all the repercussions the story had, they avoided long interviews or exaggerated expositions. They preferred to preserve their daily lives, the simple routines that helped Emily move forward. Little by little, the nightmares became less frequent. Her speech returned in small doses, and the fear that had previously dominated everything began to fade away. Emily was still a reserved, introspective girl, but she was no longer a hostage to that day in the backyard. Now, she carried good memories too, of picnics, of playing in the park, of sunny days with Rex by her side, and these new memories, little by little, were rewriting the past within her, without haste, without miracles, but with truth. As time went by, Emily began to speak more naturally at home. It wasn't a fluent conversation yet, but she could already tell her parents short stories, describe the drawings she made, and even express when she was sad or scared. Each sentence was an achievement, each word spoken a new victory over something that had previously paralyzed her. Rex, even though he was silent as always, continued to be her anchor. When she got lost in difficult memories or felt insecure in a new environment, all she had to do was touch the dog's back to feel safe again. It was as if he were an extension of the courage she was still learning to access on her own. Even at school, her teachers began to notice that she was interacting more, participating in activities with other classmates, and even being able to initiate small verbal exchanges, something that would have been unthinkable months before. One day, during a reading circle, the teacher asked each child to choose a book to take home. Emily chose a book about hero dogs. On the cover was an illustration of a German Shepherd with steady eyes and a noble expression. When she got home, she sat down on the couch with Rex by her side and began to leaf through the pages. She didn't read aloud, but pointed to the pictures and, every now and then, said a word or two, as if she were sharing the story with him. The parents, watching from afar, understood that this moment was more symbolic than anything else. It wasn't just a reading, it was recognition. It was her way of saying, even without articulating, everything that she knew who he was, not just the dog who had been by her side, but the silent hero who had guided her back to life. And there, in that simple gesture, was more power than in any speech. The years went by, and although the scars of the trauma never completely disappeared, they lost the weight they carried. Emily grew up, developed her own way of dealing with what she had experienced, and learned to put into words what she had previously only been able to express with her eyes. She was still reserved, but now she could communicate firmly, with sweetness and a maturity that was surprising. Sometimes in psychological counseling sessions, she would comment on how clearly she remembered everything: the gate opening, the strong arm, the silence that overwhelmed her. But she would say it calmly, as if she were revisiting the past, not as if she were still living in it. And whenever she spoke about it, she would mention Rex, not as an ordinary dog, but as my friend who knew what I felt even when I couldn't say anything. This phrase became almost her signature, even using it in an essay she wrote for a school contest years later. Rex grew old quickly. His fur became thinner, his steps slower, and his eyes, although still alert, already had that age shine of someone who had seen a lot of life. Emily, now older, was the one who took care of him with the same dedication she had once received. She changed his water bowls frequently, made him a more comfortable bed, and spent long afternoons by his side just reading or telling him made-up stories. When Rex finally left one peaceful morning, sleeping at the foot of her bed, there was no despair. There was silence. But this time, a different silence. It was not of pain, nor of fear. It was a silence of gratitude. Emily cried, yes, but serenely. She knew that she would lose a part of herself there, but she also knew that he would never stop being present, because deep down, the voice she had found, again, the strength she carried today, and the courage that sustained her had all started with him. Years later, as a teenager, Emily was invited to speak at an event about overcoming and emotional support, organized by an institution that cared for victims of childhood trauma. She accepted the invitation with a certain nervousness, but also with a sense of purpose. She went up on stage with the same calm eyes as always, holding an old collar in her hands, Rex's, now kept as a memento. When she began to speak, everyone in the auditorium fell silent. Her voice was firm, clear, but still carried that slow sweetness that had always accompanied her. She told her story simply, without dramatization. She spoke of fear, of silence, of the difficulty of trusting again. But she also spoke of the silent presence that helped her get through it all. And at the end, before leaving the stage, she said, "I didn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes someone just needs to be by our side, quietly, to show us that we can still win." She received a standing ovation. Today, Emily is moving forward with her life. She is studying psychology and dreams of working with children's emotional support. She says she wants to be for other children what Rex was for her. She keeps a framed photo of the dog on her desk next to her college books. Every now and then, she still feels a lump in her chest when she remembers the difficult days, but she has learned to deal with it, with maturity, with awareness, with affection. And when asked what helped her overcome all that, she smiles lightly and answers, "It was the look of someone who never said anything, but taught me everything." Because in the end, Emily's story is not about the fear that silenced her, but about the connection that brought her back to the world. And she has never forgotten that connection. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share it with someone special. There are many people who need to hear stories like this.